The US and the UK are imposing new sanctions on Belarus a year on from disputed elections. The punitive measures target state-owned enterprises and the National Olympic Committee, which is accused of money laundering. Meanwhile, the hardline president, Alexander Lukashenko, has told a news conference he won the election fairly. He denies being a dictator and says his opponents are foreign agitators. Western governments point to human rights violations and suppression of democratic processes. And our correspondent Nick Conley filed this report looking back at a turbulent 12 months since the contested vote.
A year ago, and Belarusians were queuing around the bloc to vote after their country's most lively election campaign in decades. Opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya had only been registered because the government was convinced that the political newbie had no chance of winning. Other opposition figures, including Tikhanovskaya's husband Sergei, had been jailed before they could even run. Record turnout saw many Belarusians wait for hours. Some polling stations even ran out of ballots. When authorities announced an 80% victory for Lukashenko, many Belarusians couldn't believe their eyes. Soon, evidence emerged of massive vote rigging, like this election official making an unusual exit from a polling station, aided by a policeman. After polls closed on August the 9th, unarmed protesters took to the streets of the capital Minsk and other cities. The police response was swift and brutal. Thousands were arrested and many simply disappeared for days on end. Relatives began gathering outside places of detention, desperate for any news about their loved ones. As the jailed protesters were finally released, reports spread of beatings, sexual abuse, and of life-saving medicines withheld. But the government's heavy-handed response backfired. Protests grew larger and larger as ordinary people, disgusted by the violence, joined those who'd originally come out to protest against the vote rigging. 80, 100, 200,000 civilians. At some points, it seemed like the regime's security services were more nervous than the unarmed protesters. About a month into the protests, and Lukashenko seemed to recover from the initial shock of seeing hundreds of thousands of Belarusians out protesting against him. He went to Russia to meet Vladimir Putin. On his return, the crackdown began in earnest. In the weeks and months that followed, Lukashenko's security services turned up the heat on ordinary protesters and the opposition. Its leaders were now all either behind bars or in exile, sometimes forcibly thrown out of their own country. By winter, the protesters had retreated from the streets of downtown Minsk to their own neighborhoods or even just their balconies. The risk of arrest was just too big. Soon, the government was following them home as well. But dissenting voices still crop up, even now. Student Yekaterina Vinnikova used her graduation speech to thank teachers who had lost their jobs for political reasons. The clip went viral, and Yekaterina was detained for 2 weeks. Hers is just one of many stories, and they keep on coming. For all the waves of intimidation over the past year, the regime hasn't managed to silence its critics. There are still many in Belarus who are willing to take the risk and to speak out, irrespective of the cost to themselves.
And Lukashenko spoke to journalists picked by the Belarus government in a marathon 7-hour-long news conference. DW's correspondent in Minsk, Nick Conley, was not invited, but sent us this update.
There are lots of guests from Belarus, from Russia, but also some international journalists there. He's been giving them a hard time and basically implying that all they're doing is serving foreign powers' interests and trying to undermine Belarus's sovereignty. Challenged about human rights abuses, beatings of protesters last year, he first said, "Show me facts, there aren't any, this is all made up." Then a couple of sentences further on, seemingly contradicting himself, basically implied that people who went out protesting knew what they had in store for them. So not a lot of coherence there, but definitely an attempt to really show some confidence and to really basically give the impression that a year on for these elections, the government is back in control of the situation, that it isn't challenged, and that has the confidence to basically tell the West, well, you can re-establish contact with us, re-establish relations, but at our terms. We are not going to budge, and if you want to engage with us, you're going to have to accept the situation as it is, and please stop annoying us with all this talk of human rights. That's basically the message